Cops threaten a Muslim man at a gas station, then learn he's an undercover FBI agent. We have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and become part of our dream too. The neon sign above the highway gas station flickered like it was tired of pretending everything was normal. Out on Pump 4, under the humming lights, Kareem Idris slid his card into the machine and tried to ignore the way the night air felt heavier than it should. He had driven 3 hours already, the hum of the engine still buzzing in his bones, the leftover adrenaline from his last operation refusing to settle. To anyone watching, he was just a 30-something guy with a neatly trimmed beard, dark hoodie, and worn jeans, filling up his dusty sedan. Only the weight of the leather badge case hidden under his jacket and the secure phone in his pocket hinted that his life was anything but ordinary. He watched the numbers on the pump climb, his reflection faint on the smudged glass, and took a slow breath, rehearsing the easy smile he always used with strangers. Inside the tiny convenience store, the night clerk pretended to rearrange a stack of gum while actually staring at Kareem through the window. Kareem felt the weight of the gaze but stayed focused on the pump, letting the handle click in his grip. He'd seen that look before, the mix of nervousness and suspicion that clung to him in airports, subway stations, and grocery stores whenever his beard, his skin tone, and his name lined up in someone's imagination like a threat. It was an old ache, one that had never fully healed, even after years of serving the country that still looked at him like a question mark. He shifted his stance, not wanting to look defensive, not wanting to look anything. Just normal. Invisible. But the clerk's eyes narrowed, and then his hand disappeared below the counter toward the phone. Kareem's chest tightened with a quiet, familiar dread. The distant wail of sirens started as a thin thread in the night, almost too faint to be real. Kareem heard it before anyone else did, years of training teaching him to separate layers of sound even over the low thrum of highway traffic. The sirens grew louder, clearer, impossibly fast. His fingers tightened around the pump handle. Not tonight, he thought, jaw clenching. He could have left. He had enough gas to make it to the next town. But leaving now would look guilty, and he had spent his entire life refusing to run from who he was. The pump clicked off at full, the sound sharp in the stillness, and Kareem replaced it carefully, his movements deliberate and calm. The sirens cut abruptly, replaced by the crunch of tires on gravel as two police cruisers swung into the station in a spray of dust and white headlights. The doors flew open before the engines fully stopped. Flashlights snapped on, slicing through the dim lot like accusing fingers. "Hands where we can see them," a voice barked, harsh and already angry. Kareem slowly lifted his hands, palms open, the way he had taught informants to do when things went bad. The clerk was now framed in the store doorway, phone still in his hand, eyes wide as if the scene he'd created had surprised even him. Two officers closed in, one tall and wiry with a buzz cut, the other broader, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle twitched near his ear. Their hands hovered near their holsters, thumbs already popped, the message unmistakable. "Step away from the vehicle," the taller one ordered, his flashlight beam burning into Kareem's face. Kareem blinked against the glare, feeling his heartbeat thunder in his ears. He considered the badge under his jacket, the 3 letters that could end this in a second, FBI, and then remembered every video he'd ever seen where explanations came too late. So he kept his voice level, his eyes steady, and said softly, "Officer, I'm going to speak very slowly, and I need you to really listen to me." The taller officer didn't really listen. He stepped closer, the gravel crunching under his boots like punctuation marks to his hostility. His flashlight beam shook slightly, not from fear, but from the thrill of control, as he pressed it to Kareem's chest. "Didn't ask you to talk," he snapped. "Asked you to move." The broader officer circled around Kareem's right side, trying to box him in. The fluorescent lights above them cast long shadows, distorting their figures across the pavement like something pulled from a nightmare. Kareem kept his hands up, the cold air brushing his palms. "I'm complying," he said evenly. His training taught him rhythm, tone, stillness, all the things that kept situations from detonating. But the officers weren't looking for calm. They were looking for confirmation of what they'd already decided. Behind them, the clerk watched with his arms crossed, chin raised, as if justice were unfolding exactly as he believed it should. "Check him," the broad officer barked. He gestured to Kareem's pockets, already assuming the worst. The taller one moved in, patting down Kareem's sides with unnecessarily rough shoves. Kareem felt the man's fingers graze the edge of the badge case beneath his jacket. For a split second, the officer froze, his hand hesitated like he touched something burning. But instead of stepping back to reassess, his suspicion mutated into something uglier. "He's hiding something," he announced, loud enough for the clerk to hear. The clerk straightened, vindicated. Kareem swallowed the frustration rising in his chest like fire. He could already feel the moment slipping, the one where he might still have explained, de-escalated, ended this quietly. But the officers weren't interested in quiet. They wanted spectacle, dominance, a man to corner so they could feel larger than the uniforms they wore. The broader officer grabbed Kareem's arm without warning, wrenching it behind his back with a force meant to provoke. Pain flashed through Kareem's shoulder, white and sharp. His breath caught, and his feet staggered on the uneven gravel. "Stop resisting," the man shouted instantly, voice booming into the night. It was a script, rehearsed and ready before he ever touched Kareem. The taller officer stepped in as well, grabbing Kareem's other arm and yanking it high enough to strain the tendons. Kareem's muscles tensed in instinctive defense, though he stayed rooted, refusing to give them the reaction they were fishing for. The night clerk turned away as if the scene were too predictable to hold his attention, though a small, satisfied smile touched his lips. Kareem felt sweat bead at the base of his neck despite the cold. He'd been in hostage situations calmer than this. A car pulled into the gas station at the far edge of the lot, its headlights sweeping across the scene. The driver, a man in a baseball cap, slowed as he witnessed the officers pinning Kareem against the trunk of his sedan. For a moment, Kareem hoped for a witness willing to step forward. But like so many others, the driver hesitated, watched from a safe distance, then quietly backed up and drove off, leaving the tension crackling in the air like exposed wires. The officers didn't notice. They were too focused on forcing Kareem toward the ground. "What's in the jacket?" the broad one demanded. Kareem clenched his jaw, choosing every word like a man defusing a bomb. "Something that will explain everything," he said, calm, measured, despite the pain. "But if you grab it without letting me talk, you're going to make the worst mistake of your careers." The officers scoffed in unison and reached for his jacket anyway. The taller officer yanked Kareem's jacket open with a force meant to humiliate, not investigate. The cold night air rushed against Kareem's chest as the flashlight beam swept across the leather case clipped inside. For a moment, the officer saw nothing except a dark square. Then, as he pulled it free, the gold lettering caught the fluorescent light, Federal Bureau of Investigation, bold, unmistakable, irrefutable. His hand froze mid-motion, the badge suspended between them like an accusation. Kareem watched the realization crash across the officer's face, first confusion, then disbelief, then something far sharper, fear. The broad officer, still gripping Kareem's arm, leaned in to see. His breath hitched, just slightly, but enough that Kareem felt the shift in his hold. For the first time since the cruisers arrived, the power dynamic cracked. The taller officer stepped back instinctively, the badge shaking in his hand. This could be fake," he stammered, but even his voice betrayed doubt. No counterfeit badge carried the embedded holographic threads, the raised golden seal, the matching ID card with a federal watermark shifting under the light. Kareem stood straighter, making no sudden moves, his voice steady as steel. "If it's fake," he said softly, "then call it in." The broader officer swallowed hard, his earlier confidence draining like water from a cracked cup. He loosened his grip on Kareem's wrist without meaning to, his pulse suddenly audible in the night. The clerk inside the store leaned forward, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, his expression twisting into embarrassment masked by confusion. This was not the story he expected to witness. This was not the ending he had imagined when he dialed 911. But pride is a dangerous anchor, and neither officer was ready to admit they had just threatened, and nearly assaulted, an undercover federal agent at a gas station over nothing more than their own prejudice. Why would an FBI agent be out here? The broad officer demanded, his voice unsteady. At this hour? Kareem looked him in the eyes, unblinking. Because criminals don't schedule appointments, he replied. His shoulder throbbed from the earlier twist, but his tone never wavered. And because men like you make my job harder every single day. The taller officer bristled at that, his ego flaring even as panic tightened his jaw. Look, we didn't know who you were, he muttered. You matched the description. Kareem arched an eyebrow. A description, he repeated. Let me guess, male, brown skin, beard? The officer said nothing. Silence answered for him. The radio on the broad officer's vest crackled to life, filling the tension with static. Dispatch's voice filtered through, calm, clipped, unmistakably serious. Confirming identity, Agent Kareem Idris, FBI Counterterrorism Division. Active. Authorized. Approach with caution and respect. The last word hung in the air like a verdict. Both officers stiffened, as if the air itself had turned against them. The taller one lowered the badge slowly, careful now, as though afraid it might burn him. The broad officer finally released Kareem's arm completely, stepping back with the rigid posture of a man realizing just how far out of line he had been. The fluorescent lights above flickered again, casting their faces in harsh, unforgiving brightness. Kareem lifted his jacket, retrieved his badge, and clipped it back in place with deliberate precision. Then he looked between the two men, not triumphant, not gloating, simply resolute. Now, he said quietly, do you want to hear why I'm really here? Neither officer answered. They stood rigid, shoulders stiff, breathing shallow, as if any movement might deepen the hole they'd already dug. The taller one shifted his weight, glancing toward the cruisers where their dash cams blinked silently, blinking proof that everything had been recorded. The broader officer's jaw worked as he tried to decide whether speaking would make things worse. The power had shifted entirely, yet Kareem felt no satisfaction. His pulse was still too high, adrenaline still tightening every muscle in his back. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself the way he'd been trained, then stepped away from his car with calm deliberation. You need to listen now, he said, voice low but absolute. Their eyes flicked to him, wary, reluctant, but aware they no longer had authority to interrupt. Kareem reached into his jacket with slow, intentional movements and pulled out a small encrypted phone, the kind only issued to agents working in the field. The device's screen glowed faintly as he tapped his code, revealing a message stamped in red, active tracking, do not delay. He turned it slightly so the officers could see. I'm in the middle of an undercover surveillance, he explained, his tone sharpening. I've been following a suspect tied to a weapons trafficking ring, one that operates in this region at night. I stopped for gas because my tank was running low. That's it. No threat. No crime. No justification for what you did. The taller officer's eyes widened at the mention of weapons trafficking, but he stayed silent, guilt creeping into his posture. The clerk inside the store stepped back from the window, suddenly smaller, suddenly unsure of himself. Kareem continued, his voice gaining weight with every word. The man I'm tracking passed through this highway 20 minutes ago. I had him in visual range until I pulled in here. When you showed up like this, he gestured to the cruisers, the drawn tension, the faint impression of the officer's grip still burning on his arm, you compromised the entire operation. The broad officer finally spoke, regret mixing with defensiveness. We didn't know. Kareem met his gaze sharply. Exactly. You didn't know. But you acted anyway. The silence that followed was heavy, pulsing with the undeniable truth. Even the hum of the neon sign above them sounded ashamed. The officers shifted, eyes down, as if the pavement might offer an escape from responsibility. Then Kareem's phone vibrated, not with a call, but with a push notification that made his heart drop. An alert flashed in bold letters, suspect signal reacquired, 14 miles westbound. Possibility of detour. His breath froze in his chest. 14 miles wasn't far, but it was far enough to be dangerous, far enough that he might lose the lead for good if he didn't leave immediately. He looked up at the officers, urgency sharpening his features. "You two need to step aside," he said, each word firm and unarguable. "You've already delayed me. I can't afford another second." The taller officer stepped back quickly, his earlier arrogance evaporating. The broad officer nodded stiffly. But Kareem wasn't finished. "You're going to do more than step aside," he added, voice dropping into something colder, more commanding. "You're going to help me." The officers exchanged a startled glance, because in that moment, they realized the night wasn't over, and their biggest test hadn't even begun. The officers stared at Kareem as if he'd spoken in another language. Help him? After everything that had just unfolded? The broad officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple jerking. "Help you, how?" he asked, his voice stripped of bravado. Kareem stepped closer, his presence suddenly larger than the parking lot could contain. The shift wasn't physical, it was authority, competence, the magnetic gravity of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "Your cruisers are faster than my sedan," he explained, tapping the encrypted phone against his palm. "Your lights can clear the road. And you know this area better than any federal map." The taller officer frowned, conflicted. "We're not equipped for federal ops." Kareem's gaze sharpened to a blade. "You were equipped enough to detain me without cause." The officer shut his mouth, chastened. Kareem paced once, eyes on the highway like he could already see the suspect van disappearing into the dark. "The man I'm tracking is linked to a trafficking pipeline that's been supplying illegal weapons to multiple states. We believe he's transporting components tonight, components meant for an assembly drop before dawn." He stopped pacing and looked directly at the officers, letting the weight of the situation settle on them. "If he gets away, those weapons will disappear into the underground market. And the next time someone gets hurt, I'll know that the moment he slipped through my fingers happened right here, because two officers were too proud to admit they messed up." The words weren't cruel, they were simply true. The truth landed heavier than any accusation. The broad officer exhaled shakily, rubbing the back of his neck. "What exactly do you need us to do?" he asked. Kareem's expression softened by a fraction, not forgiveness, but recognition of responsibility finally taking root. "I need one cruiser to escort me and the other to run point ahead. We'll use your radio to request a temporary road priority if necessary. No weapons drawn, no heroics, no sudden moves. You follow my lead, and you don't question my calls." The taller officer hesitated. "Our sergeant's going to ask why we left the scene." Kareem stepped forward, lowering his voice. "And you'll tell him you acted on the direct request of a federal agent during an active counterterrorism operation." He let the words settle. "Which is exactly what you're doing." A beat of silence passed, the kind that feels like a balance tipping. Then the broad officer nodded, slowly but decisively. "We'll do it." The taller officer followed, swallowing his pride like a bitter pill. "Yeah, okay." Kareem gave a single nod in return, already shifting into tactical mode. But before turning toward their cruisers, he added one more thing, not to shame them, but to mark the moment. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about fixing the damage before it becomes irreversible." The officers absorbed his words with solemn expressions, the gravity of the situation finally eclipsing their earlier assumptions. Moments later, engines roared to life, red and blue light spilling across the gas station pavement as the unlikely trio prepared for a chase none of them had expected when the night began. The cruisers peeled out of the gas station with a surge of urgency that vibrated through the pavement. Kareem slipped into his sedan, starting the engine with a controlled breath. His shoulders still throbbed from the officer's earlier grip, but the familiar rush of mission focus dulled the pain. The highway stretched ahead like a dark ribbon, empty except for the fading glow of distant taillights. In his rearview mirror, the two officers aligned their cruisers exactly as instructed, one behind him, one accelerating to take point. Their hesitation was gone now, replaced by the austere seriousness of men who knew they were no longer playing at authority, they were accountable to it. Kareem tapped his encrypted device, watching the moving dot representing the suspect veer westward. 14 miles and closing, he murmured. We're not losing him tonight. The point cruiser activated its lights but not the siren, illuminating the road in rhythmic flashes. The taller officer's voice crackled through Kareem's radio, braced and focused. Road clear for 2 miles. No obstructions. Behind him, the broad officer echoed, rear secure. No trailing vehicles. Their tone had changed completely. They were no longer barking commands but reporting with disciplined precision. Kareem merged onto the highway, pressing the accelerator until the sedan hummed beneath him. The wind tore past the windows as the convoy formed, carving through the night like a silent arrow. A distant truck cast a long shadow across the pavement as they passed. Its driver glanced at the speeding lights, unaware of the covert chase unfolding beside him. Kareem's heartbeat synced with the engine's cadence. This was the rhythm he trusted, the one that had saved his life more times than he could count. The closer they drew to the suspect's signal, the more the air thickened with anticipation. Kareem's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as the encrypted phone vibrated with a location update. 8.3 miles. 6.7 miles. 5.1, his gaze sharpened. He's slowing, Kareem muttered. Could be a stop. Could be a transfer. The taller officer's voice returned through the radio, intersection ahead. Lots of blind turns. Kareem knew the implication, danger, potential ambush, limited visibility. Maintain formation, he ordered. Point car slows to 70. Rear car holds at 60. No overtaking until I confirm visual. The officers obeyed without question. The earlier power struggle dissolved into something unexpectedly functional. Their cruisers moved like extensions of his will, a temporary unit forged not by trust, but by necessity. Then, just beyond the next bend, Kareem spotted it, a white cargo van parked on the shoulder, engine running, hazard lights blinking in an oddly deliberate pattern. The van's rear doors twitched, as if someone inside had just slammed something heavy into place. Kareem's pulse spiked. That's him, he said into the radio, his voice dropping into a tone that brooked no hesitation. The night seemed to hold its breath. The two officers tensed in their cruisers, the shift palpable even through the radio static. Kareem flicked off his headlights, letting the darkness cloak him. The convoy slowed in unison. This was no longer pursuit, it was contact. And contact meant the entire night was about to turn sharper, faster, and far more dangerous than any of them had intended. The convoy crept forward until the rhythmic pulse of the van's hazard lights painted the pavement in alternating slices of orange. Kareem eased his foot off the gas, letting his sedan glide into a slow, silent crawl. His mind shifted into tactical clarity, every sound sharper, every shadow a potential threat. The broad officer's voice broke through the radio, low and tight, rear secure, but something feels off. Kareem agreed. The van was too still, too deliberate, as if waiting not to flee but to be approached. He rolled down his window just enough to let the cold night air slip inside. Through the quiet hum of engines, he heard it, a faint metallic clank from the back of the van. Not cargo shifting. Not equipment falling. Something being loaded or locked into place. The realization tightened his grip on the wheel. This wasn't a simple transport. Something active was happening inside. Kareem raised the encrypted phone, scanning the last location ping. The suspect's tracker had stopped exactly here, no movement for the last 3 minutes. He's inside, Kareem said, his voice a steady anchor. Prepare for contact, but stay in your vehicles until I call it. The taller officer in the point cruiser breathed out sharply, tension crackling through his reply. Understood. Kareem pulled his sedan to a stop 30 feet behind the van, close enough to act, far enough to react. The broad officer positioned his cruiser diagonally behind Kareem, forming a shield. The formation was tight, controlled, almost seamless, remarkable considering the chaos that had sparked their involvement only an hour earlier. Kareem's eyes scanned the tree line along the highway's edge. No movement. No silhouettes. But the silence felt unnatural, as if the night itself were holding something back. He stepped out of his sedan with slow, deliberate movements, one hand raised to signal the officers to stay put. Gravel shifted softly beneath his boots. The van's hazard lights flickered across his face, casting momentary shadows beneath his eyes. He approached the vehicle's left side, staying low and angled, minimizing his silhouette. Every instinct told him the suspect wasn't alone. He reached the driver's side window and peered inside. Empty. The engine hummed, but the seat was vacant. The keys were still in the ignition. Kareem felt a cold ripple move through him. Drivers don't walk away from running vehicles unless they plan to return quickly or unless they're staging a trap. He moved to the back, placing 2 fingers lightly against the van's rear doors. The metal vibrated subtly beneath his touch, pulsing with irregular thuds. Someone was definitely inside, but not moving freely. Not trying to escape. The rhythm felt wrong. Before he could signal the officers, the tall one whispered urgently through the radio, "Agent Idris, movement in the woods, 5 o'clock." Kareem pivoted, heart slamming against his ribs. A figure darted between trees, too fast to catch more than a silhouette, but the direction, the speed, the timing made his stomach drop. The suspect wasn't inside the van. He was watching the van. Watching them. Kareem crouched instinctively, eyes locking onto the tree line. "Do not pursue," he ordered, voice sharp. "Repeat, do not pursue. Maintain formation." The officers froze in their cruisers, hands hovering near their radios. Kareem turned back to the van, dread sharpening his breath as he finally understood the vibration. The suspect hadn't been loading weapons. The suspect had been arming a device. A faint beep echoed inside, barely audible, but unmistakable. The van wasn't cargo. It was a trap. A trap timed for someone else, or perhaps now, for them. The faint, rhythmic beeping inside the van sharpened into a pulse Kareem recognized instantly, not explosives, but a proximity-triggered alarm. A diversion device. A lure. His breath tightened as the realization clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The suspect hadn't fled to escape. He had fled to watch who came for the van. Kareem moved back a step, raising a closed fist toward the cruisers. "Freeze, hold position." The officers obeyed without hesitation, their cruisers idling like nervous animals sensing the predator in the dark. The hazard lights of the van flashed across Kareem's steady expression, carving his features into hard angles. He crouched beside the rear tire, listening. Under the beep, there was something else, a low hum. "Electrical. Active. It's a data wipe unit," Kareem muttered, breath clouding in the cold. "He's clearing evidence. And unless they stopped it in seconds, the entire trafficking trail would vanish forever." Kareem pulled a thin black multi-tool from his pocket, not a weapon, but the kind of field instrument designed for delicate work under impossible conditions. He slid beneath the van just far enough to see the underside. A rectangular device was bolted against the chassis, wires glowing faint red like veins under skin. The white module was connected to a server unit inside the van, pulsing with every completed deletion. It wasn't a bomb, but losing the data would be nearly as devastating for the investigation. He backed out quickly, dust clinging to his jacket. "Officer Lane," he said into the radio, addressing the taller one, "your cruiser's spotlight, illuminate the rear doors on my mark." Lane answered immediately, voice steady now, "Ready." Kareem exhaled once, then signaled. A blast of bright white light cut through the darkness, washing the van in brilliance and freezing the woods behind them into stark silhouettes. The sudden illumination flushed the hidden figure from the tree line. The suspect sprinted deeper into the woods, realizing his surveillance advantage was gone. The broad officer instinctively reached for his door. "Stay put." Kareem barked. "He wants you to chase him. The real target is the data." The door closed with a thud. Kareem stepped toward the rear of the van, fingers brushing the cold metal. He pressed his ear briefly against the door. Inside, the server hum rose in pitch, speeding up. "We're out of time," he murmured. He pulled the door handle slowly, expecting resistance, but to his surprise, it lifted easily. The door swung open with a creak. Inside, the van was stacked with crates of weapon components, triggers, pressure plates, illegal rifle parts, but at the center sat the true prize, a hardened server unit transmitting its last breaths of data. Red lights flickered angrily across its interface. Wipe in progress. Kareem climbed in and knelt beside the unit. His hands moved with the memory of 100 field briefings. Lane, Ramirez, hold visual on the perimeter, he ordered. If the suspect circles back, I need a warning before he hits the road. Copy, both officers replied in unison. Kareem pulled the casing off the server, exposing the wiring. The white module was feeding directly into the main processor, severing it blindly could corrupt everything. He scanned the wiring once, twice, forcing himself not to rush despite the countdown screaming in the LEDs. Then he found it, a thin yellow line braided with copper threads. The manual override. Of course, he muttered. Old school tech. He pinched the line with the multi-tool and sliced. The hum cut instantly, dropping into a stunned silence. The white lights froze mid-blink. The data was intact. A long breath escaped him, one he hadn't realized he was holding. He climbed down from the van and stepped into the cold night air just as the officers approached cautiously. Is it done? The broad officer asked, unable to hide the hope in his voice. Kareem nodded. The weapons pipeline stays exposed. You helped save a lot of people tonight. The tall officer glanced toward the dark woods, where the suspect had vanished. Shouldn't we go after him? Kareem shook his head. He's alone, he's on foot, and he's desperate. We'll track him tomorrow with federal teams. He paused, his voice softening, not with emotion, but with something like measured grace. Tonight wasn't about catching him. It was about not losing what he carried. The officers stood there in the flashing glow of the hazard lights, exhaustion carving honesty into their expressions. For the first time since the confrontation began at the gas station, the night felt still, not safe, not resolved, but held together by something steadier than fear. A quiet understanding. Kareem closed the van doors gently, sealing the evidence inside. The neon glare from the cruisers reflected off his badge as he turned back to the officers. You judged me before you knew me, Kareem said calmly. But when it mattered, you followed my lead. Neither officer defended themselves. They didn't have to. Their silence was an admission. Learn from tonight, Kareem continued. Because next time, the man you stop might not be able to save you from your own mistake. The broad officer lowered his head. The tall officer swallowed hard. And for a moment, the wind moved through the trees like an answer neither of them could speak. Kareem walked toward his sedan, opening the door as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. Agent Idris, the broader officer called softly. Kareem paused. Yes? The man took a breath. We're glad you were the one who showed up tonight. Kareem nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in closure. Me too, he said. Then he slipped into his car, engine rumbling to life. As he pulled back onto the highway, the sky shifted from black to deep indigo, the first light stretching across the asphalt like the beginning of something new. He drove on, not triumphant, not bitter, but resolute. Because the night had revealed something important, sometimes the most dangerous confrontation wasn't between law and crime, but between truth and assumption. And tonight, truth had won. If you made it this far, subscribe, leave your like, and tell us where you're watching from. Thank you, and see you next time.